A very pleasant day to everyone all over the world. Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon at magandang gabi. Magandang bumati sa ating sariling wika sa Tagalog sapagkat yan ang nagsasabi na maganda ang ating kinabukasan, maganda ang ating hinaharap, maganda rin ang ating nakaraan. So this is your hour, and over the past so many hours that we have spent together, I have been trying to go back and forth to the past, to the present, the relevance of all the things that have happened then as far as we are concerned today on a day-to-day basis. Well, recently there have been several movements of some individuals who would want to come up with a kind of a museum that they will construct at the University of the Philippines. And this museum is supposed to be dedicated to all of those Filipinos who have suffered, allegedly suffered, under the martial law of President Ferdinand E. Marcos, which was 11 years, from 1972 to 1981. So that is the martial law period, and during that time, as I have already summarized so many times in the past, we have had the most massive infrastructure built in our country, combined with all the other infrastructures past Marcos and post Marcos. Now we are starting with infrastructure again with President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, because that's exactly what building a nation is all about. You build a nation through its infrastructure. But other than that, there was also many other things that were constructed during that time, so that the monuments, if you're going to speak of them, as far as that particular period and also the 20 years of President Marcos' administration are concerned, they are actually the testimonies in cement, in steel, and in all those structures that are still benefiting the Filipino people throughout the country. So there is no need anymore to build other museums in honor of President Marcos, because he is already enshrined on the roads that you use, the airports, the seaports, the dams that give us all the power that we need, likewise the geothermal and non-conventional sources of energy, and many others. But the most important is the fact that he has given us a Filipino ideology, which is based on what he has exclaimed as soon as he got the election for the office of the presidency in 1965 and the start of his administration in 1966. And that was his battle cry. From then until 1985 and until today, we have to say that together with him, this nation can be great again. That was the entire idea, the vision that he had, that for every Filipino, he could give the sense of dignity and pride to be called a Filipino in his own land, with the pride of that identity precisely. But what is this that they're talking about as far as alleged crimes committed during the time of martial law and several other indicators that that particular period was supposed to be the dark ages of our country? Well, I cannot describe it as best as what a columnist, a writer, and a former member of the CCP and the NPA and all of these activist and militant movements that would want to overthrow the government of President Marcos during his time. And this is Mr. Rod Katipunan, who has studied carefully the life of Marcos, his writings, and everything else that he has gathered as far as Ferdinand Edralin Marcos is concerned. And so he has come up with several books, likewise, and several statements. He has been invited for interviews in several radio and television companies, and that is exactly why we have to quote what he has said regarding this monument that they intend to construct. So this is not yet actually on the table, but there is already many publicity writings and all kinds of propaganda regarding this. And I would like to read his column. This came out in the Manila Standard, and if you could follow his column every time that he has postings of this. I posted this also on Facebook so that we can all be able to read this. The title of his piece is A Misrepresentation of the Past, and I'd like to read it by way of answering what this museum that they intend to construct at the University of the Philippines, as far as that is concerned. And so here I quote and I read exactly what he has titled his column with, "A Misrepresentation of Our Past." And he said, "The proposed martial law museum is intended to remind us how stupid we are." And so I quote his column and I will read it directly to you, especially to those who are abroad and overseas in several other countries. I see your postings and I see your comments coming from everywhere, from Europe, from South America, from the United States of America, from several countries other than, some in Africa, even the Middle East, and all of this. To all of you who may not be able to subscribe to our broadsheets here in the country and who may not have been able to read this, because this came out on October 3rd of this month, actually, just a couple of days ago, October 3rd, 2020. And I read his column, which says, this writer, and I'm referring here to Rod Kapunan because this is his writing, this writer cannot in conscience condone what those select groups of political agitators would like the rest of the Filipinos to honor in that museum, dubbed as martial law victims and human rights violations during the Marcos regime. Our objection is not what transpired, but on how they are attempting to distort and misrepresent our history. First, this museum to be erected in the grounds of the country's premier university, called the bastion of intellectualism, does not depict a war between the Filipino people against those that occupied and oppressed us. Rather, it is one of rebellion waged by those who sought to overthrow the duly constituted authority. Second, while the promoters of this jaundiced museum are silent on what should be honored as heroes, it is clear that the museum openly depicts the President of the Republic as a villain. Third, the museum seeks to equally glorify the role of the oligarchy, the church, the international monopoly class led by the U.S. imperialists, with the commercial and other establishments, and the communists likewise as their newly found and uncanny ally. Instead of workers and farmers, they substituted them with those radicalized student activists who commandeered the university campus to glorify their so-called Diliman Commune in 1971. Fourth, the museum is a continuing attempt to collect from the government compensation fees in the guise that the fund is taken from the so-called ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses. Fifth, the proposed museum will be erected at a cost of 500 million pesos. The irony is that 1.4 hectares properly located there are actually allotted by the University of the Philippines to honor those who fought against the government. The museum is a reflection of our inner consciousness that remains entombed to what is being depicted to us by the United States of America as a dark chapter in our history. How we react to that tumultuous chapter is practically the same way that many of our people continue to express their gratitude to those who oppressed and exploited them, but in a different milieu. There is nothing to validate in that museum, except to say that the University of the Philippines has descended to that level of intellectual irrationality, and our people cannot figure out why we condemn martial law, but never asked why it was declared. Surely the players of that tumultuous event did not expect riot, arson, vandalism to happen. Nonetheless, it happened, because the actors from the other side of the fence were consciously determined to test the limitation of democracy and freedom, refusing to concede that they were in fact engaged in a rebellion. Most disgustingly, the proposed museum unwittingly condemns the former president in his bid to contain the escalating violence. Surely it is the same political scum that exacted compensation for their vandalism that will attend the opening ceremony as if to reminisce the insurgency and terrorism that they themselves committed. It will be a grand reunion done by their continuing extortion from the government that they equally continue to defile and express contempt for. Frankly, the proposed museum is intended to remind us how stupid we are. The name of Marcos will again reverberate as villain and absolute evil that caused their alleged sufferings and personal failures in life. The scum of society pretending to be highly intellectual and ideological are the same animals that demystified the Marcos Monument and dynamited it in that particular place going to Baguio for us to completely erase his legacy for the people. Let us not debate on the constitutionality of martial law, but concentrate on the two prominent personalities that today are being assiduously elevated as saints by the traitorous Liberal Party and revered as demigods by those communists led by Jose Maria Sison. If these people truly believe that the doctrine they are preaching is just, then they should ask why those whom they indoctrinated ended up as mendicant paupers of the state that they hate so much. Will it be too much of an insult if they will voluntarily place a small picture or a bust of or a monument of Jose Maria Sison and for Ninoy Aquino to be put up in the museum? It is to show their bravery and real color. It is most inconceivable even to those rebels who died in the field to think that one day a museum will be put up honoring them as martyrs. In fact, even a summa cum laude graduate of UP will die of envy for not being granted one. No matter how they distort and misrepresent that event, the implication is clear that those scum of the earth that goaded the government to put up a museum right in the heart of the University of the Philippines, it is their final insult to our people that they always pretend to liberate. There is intellectual dishonesty in them, for while they coyly omitted Sison, people who have their true sentiment of country can dialectically interpret the fallacy of their own doctrine. Many refuse to acknowledge the righteousness of their reincarnated Pol Pot, who eliminated many of his comrades during that period of ideological cleansing. The deep division within the ranks is a reflection of their mishandling of contradiction that turned out to be one of the tyrannical rule that rather than the democratic democratic centralism. Most intriguing is why Ninoy Aquino has been given a place in that museum. The placing of that man inside the museum has no historical value except to remind the people that it was the same van that was used by Absecom where the dead body of Ninoy was dumped after he was shot. Regrettably, despite having his wife and his son becoming presidents, they adamantly refused to reinvestigate the case, if only to identify the mastermind. We could only speculate that maybe the traitorous political party feared that it would incur the ire of their foreign operatives. The role of Ninoy remains an enigma to Philippine politics. Many believe that he had knowledge of the Plaza Miranda bombing, where he was expected to deliver a speech, and strongly failed to show up. This is worth noting because this is one of the important considerations why Marcos declared martial law, for which the perpetrators of the same crime tossed it back by blaming Marcos. Moreover, Ninoy was killed long after martial law was lifted, yet they refused to acknowledge that because that could place his role outside the purpose of the museum, instantly it became a museum of the Liberal Party. To recap, the museum is to be erected not in memory of the victims of typhoons, of floods, of earthquakes, or of conflagrations, but in honor of those who suffered by an act of the state for self-defense. With or without Marcos, martial law can be declared as it was during the time of President Quirino. In that instance, the people who suffered during that period blamed them for that. Because Marcos had been ousted, their logic is that those instrumental for his removal from office should be honored in that museum. By implication, Sison should be as a hero for the fact that he was arrested and jailed but subsequently released by Cory Aquino without a question about his role in the Plaza Miranda bombing. So there you have it. That is the column that I just read, written by Rod Kapunan, and I would like to emphasize the fact that he was a former member and a high-ranking member of the Communist Party of the Philippines during the 60s and the 70s. He was also one of the propagandists during that time, and he was active as far as his membership was concerned until after President Marcos has left the Philippines. Rod Kapunan decided to read everything that has been written during the time of President Marcos. He also read all the books that President Marcos wrote. He studied all the departments that were in existence during the time of President Marcos. He gathered all the data and all the different elements that are contained in many of the programs of President Marcos, and he has written several books insofar as not really to defend in a way the Marcos regime, but to state out the truth and the fact that these are the things that have been established, these were the things that were accomplished, and these are the things that made the new society originate during the time as declared by President Marcos himself, that the declaration of martial law was actually for the formation and the creation of a new society. So I just want to read it because I think that is the best explanation that so far I have found regarding the objections to that museum that they intend to construct at the University of the Philippines. As he said, this is not in honor of people who died in calamities or natural disasters. This is not even in honor, a museum not even in honor of our soldiers and our policemen who defended our country against these rebel forces, against the secessionist movement, and also against criminality as far as the police are concerned, to maintain the peace and order of our respective communities. Of course, we know where this is coming from. It has been how long has it been? 34 years since the Marcoses have left the Philippines, since President Marcos gave up his seat of power as President of the Republic in order to avoid a civil war, because that was the threat that the American embassy was telegraphing Malacanang at the time, telling President Marcos that should there be the people that will be moving from EDSA to Malacanang, he should not create any violence against them or try to defend himself with arms or ammunition, because that would cause a civil war. So there was actually a veiled threat. But Marcos had no intention whatsoever, because you must remember the fact that at that time, the major service commands were all loyal to President Marcos, except the head of the Philippine Constabulary. I do not say that it is the entire Philippine Constabulary, but only the chief of the Philippine Constabulary, and that was Fidel V. Ramos. So we have seen that experience, we have lived through it, and we have actually seen it on television when even General Ver would have wanted to attack the forces that were there within the compound of the military camp in Camp Aguinaldo, because they transferred from one camp to the other. And also several of the other commanding generals of the Air Force, the Navy, all the major commands were already actually waiting for the command of President Marcos to bring their tanks or their airplanes or whatever it is that would be able to decimate the people there at EDSA. But President Marcos refused to do this. In fact, on television, we heard him say, no, we are not going to execute any firearms or ammunitions, whether this will be small or whatever it is. No way. We saw this on television, and this was repeated, and at the top of his voice, as a matter of fact, also at the top of the voice of General Ver who was the chief of staff at the time, saying that we are ready. He said, we are ready to attack. But that is exactly how the president held back and offered the position of presidency and offered his honor even and the rest of his administration, and decided to leave Malacanang so that we will not, break down into anarchy and possibly civil war. You who have not lived through the 1985 campaign period for the snap elections for the presidency, you would not know the sense and the feeling of how divided the country was. There was a lot of rage and hatred, especially coming from those in the camp of Aquino and Laurel, and they were the ones that actually were demanding that there should already be a change and so forth, until Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos broke away from the administration of President Marcos. But the animosity and the anger and the hatred was so severe that if they knew that you were belonging to one camp, there were invectives that were shouted, and this went on for both camps. So that was how the country was really divided between what they call the colors of the yellow and the colors of the red, white, and blue. The red, white, and blues were those that were the loyalists to President Marcos, and the yellows were those that were with the camp of Mrs. Aquino et al., the Liberal Party, the Laban, as a matter of fact, with that sign that they have showing that they are out there to fight. But let's get back to this museum that they intend to build, which is supposedly in honor of those that were allegedly victimized during the 11-year period of martial law. I must have repeated this a number of times, but I will have to emphasize it any further. For those who may not have been able to listen to what I've already said before, let us summarize, or at least briefly have a narrative regarding this human rights thing. A human right violation is a criminal offense. It is a criminal offense. It is punished with several degrees of how many years you will be jailed and what other punishments you are given by the revised penal code. But it is and remains to this day a criminal offense. Anybody that has caused torture or the murder or the killing of any other individual as a human rights violation of that person is a criminal, in the sense that once he or she is hied to court, then he becomes a criminal as far as we are concerned. I will repeat, a human rights violation is a criminal offense. So this means that all of those that suffered or allegedly suffered or were tortured during the period of martial law should have filed a criminal case against those that caused the human rights violation against them. If they're blaming President Marcos from doing this, then they should have filed a criminal complaint against Ferdinand Marcos. And Ferdinand Marcos, who it was already in Honolulu at the time, should have been allowed to return to the Philippines and defend himself before all of these people who are now claiming that they were victimized as far as President Marcos is concerned. Now, where did all of this human rights thing originate? There was no case filed by anyone here in our country with the Commission on Human Rights or with any court against Ferdinand E. Marcos and any member of the Marcos family. None. We have the certifications of the chairmen or the chairpersons, because at one time there were women who actually chaired the Human Rights Commission, and they have certified that during their term there have been no criminal complaints filed in their Commission of Human Rights against Ferdinand Marcos or any member of his family. Now, let us go to Honolulu, because this is one that is celebrated in media, but it is actually full of anomalous statements. And let me just briefly say, the human rights violation case that was filed in Honolulu is not a criminal case. I will repeat. The human rights violation case that was filed in Honolulu against Ferdinand Marcos was not a criminal case for human rights violation. It was a civil case for damages. They filed a civil case for damages. This means that they are claiming that they should be paid for an injury or a death that they are not proving beyond reasonable doubt in the court. Let me repeat that. The case in Honolulu is a civil case for damages. They're asking for payment for crimes, for alleged crimes, or for alleged human rights violations that have never been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Why is this so? Let us begin by citing the individuals that filed the original complaint. I have their names here. I failed to mention them the last time. That is Trajano versus Ferdinand Marcos. And then you have Jose Maria Sison versus Ferdinand Marcos, Hilao versus Ferdinand Marcos, and Ortigas versus Ferdinand Marcos. So you have here Jose Maria Sison, Hilao, Ortigas, and Trajano. Okay. There were four individuals or heirs or sons or daughters of those that already died, that were allegedly killed or allegedly were tortured. And since Marcos is in Honolulu, they decided to file the claim for damages against Ferdinand Marcos for these individuals. So it was led by Jose Maria Sison, who, at the time that he filed this complaint, was already registered with the National Security, Homeland Security of the United States of America as a terrorist group. It is the United States Pentagon and State Department and Defense Department that have actually categorized the New People's Army and the National Democratic Front and the Communist Party of Jose Maria Sison as a terrorist group. So in spite of that, they filed these cases in Honolulu. The judge that actually held that had jurisdiction over these cases was Judge Judge Harold Fong. He was the judge in the court in Honolulu, and he dismissed all of these complaints. First, for the reason of the act of sovereign state, meaning that another country, such as the United States of America, such as the United States Court of Harold Fong in Honolulu, cannot handle a human rights violation case because it is against the act of sovereignty. This is against a sovereign country and a sovereign head of that country, and that another country cannot interfere in the judicial processing of that country. And so he said, because of the act of state doctrine, that case that was filed in his court in Honolulu must be filed in the Philippines. It is also a violation of the Torture Act of the United States of America, with the same reason, that human rights violation of a foreign person or a foreign entity should be tried in the country of origin. So that is why those cases were dismissed. But as I've already said, there was interference in the court because there was a filing of some kind of a note verbal, whatever you call this. This was coming from the former ambassador to the Philippines, Ambassador Armacost, and he told the court that they have to refile that case, take it out of Judge Harold Fong's court, and transfer it to the jurisdiction of the Los Angeles Court of Manuel Real. Because, he said, we must be able to satisfy the deal that we have with the administration of Mrs. Aquino, which is we have to indict the Marcoses, possibly throw them in jail or whatever it is. The cases against the Marcoses should proceed to show Mrs. Aquino that the United States of American Justice Department or State Department are following the agreement that was signed between this Victoria Tensing of their own Department of Justice and Jovita Salonga of our government. And so because of that signing of that memorandum of understanding or memorandum of agreement, Armacos said they have to proceed again to refile these human rights cases with another court, which is the court in LA of Manuel Real. So that is what happened to these four cases that were originally filed. Another violation is the fact that the cases implicated Marcos as a resident of Honolulu, and that is why they filed it there in the Honolulu court. But I showed you last week the visa of President Marcos, and there you could read, as I've said, that his visa was a parole visa, which means that he was there, also written in that parole visa, he was there as a special guest. The visa did not say that he was a resident of the United States of America. The visa said in their own handwriting, the U.S. Visa Immigration Offices declared him as a special guest, and that his visa was a parole visa, meaning it was subject to renewal every month, every 2 months, every 3 months, until it was supposed to have been, the final date would have been something like August 1989 or something, or some date there in August. So that was another violation, because it was accepted in court that he was a resident of Honolulu, but he was not. He was in Honolulu as a special guest, and he was holding a parole visa to indicate the identity and also the classification of his being there in Honolulu. But what happened was, well, the bright minds of those that were actually handling the cases there decided that why should there only be 4 individuals and 4 families that would be benefited from a claim for damages. I will repeat, the human rights case that was filed was not a criminal case. It was a human rights case for compensation. It was a claim for damages. It is something like you are claiming for the payment of, let's say for instance, your vehicle with perhaps some of your relatives was bumped or had a crash with another vehicle, and there were injuries, of some of your relatives riding there. But what you did was you filed in court to claim payment for the repair of your vehicle and for the injuries of those inside the vehicle, or perhaps if somebody died, also for the death benefits for that person that died because of that accident. But you are not proving in court that there was an accident. There is no proof that you are presenting to the court that there was actually a crash that happened, and there was a damage to the vehicle, and that there were injuries actually that these people suffered. Because, as we've said, this human rights case that was filed in Honolulu was not a human rights violation case, not a criminal case. It was a civil case for damages. It was claiming compensation for an act which has not been proven beyond reasonable doubt in the court. Why do I keep on mentioning beyond reasonable doubt? Because I've already said a human rights violation is a criminal offense. So that's exactly what the human rights violation cases are all about. A civil case asking for payment for injuries or deaths that were never proven beyond reasonable doubt. Be that as it may, they decided to come up with something like 3,840 names, because that's exactly the names that were registered in that court. But the media keeps on saying 10,000 were victimized. However else these numbers go, again we have to say that the person who actually wrote about this was the chief of the intelligence office of our armed forces, the late General Galileo Quintanar, a fine gentleman of a soldier, one of the brightest minds that we have seen as far as the armed forces are concerned. And of course, as far as the military is concerned, and even the civilians, they know the character, the credibility, and the credentials of Galileo Quintanar. He was the chief intelligence officer of Corazon Aquino. And that is where he has written about this human rights case in a book. You could buy it there at the National Bookstore. And that is where also he did all the research necessary to determine who these people are that are claiming. And you will be surprised to know that almost 2/3 of those people in that listing were part of the order of battle. The order of battle meaning that these were the forces in the hinterlands of the NPA and the NDF, the secessionists and the Islamic militants that had encounters with our military and were either decapitated or injured and so forth. 2/3 of those names. 1/3, he said, could be legitimate claims. But again, despite the fact that they could have been legitimate claims, not one of them filed a criminal case against Ferdinand Marcos and any of members of his family. Let me repeat. A human rights violation case is a criminal case. It should be proven beyond reasonable doubt. There is no such case ever filed up to this day against any member of the President Marcos family or against President Marcos himself. So what are we talking about? We are talking about a museum that they intend to set up to say, these are the atrocities of Ferdinand Marcos during martial law. Well, that is exactly why we have the writer of this column saying that this is a misrepresentation of our past. The martial law period, sad to say, does not need any monument, or perhaps I should say, happy to say, does not need any monument. We have all these roads and highways and bridges network. We have the 1 million hectares of irrigation all over the country that have caused us to be self-sufficient in basic agricultural needs and food, to the effect that even rice was in abundance at that time, and that we had for the first time in our agricultural history, or our history for that matter, we had been able to export rice. There have been all kinds of possible sources of energy, whether they are natural sources or they are non-conventional sources, such as the geothermal, which was first established, built, connected, and operational during the time of President Marcos, to the effect that we were second only to the United States of America as far as the source of geothermal power is concerned. In fact, this was even mentioned by President Richard Nixon when he invited Mrs. Marcos to look at some of their geothermal plants, so that we have an idea of how our geothermal plants are also operating. And he was surprised to know how many megawatts of power our geothermal was producing. And that was when he said, my goodness, you are almost you almost have as much source of geothermal as we have here in the United States of America. And that is why, we are, that is exactly why we are geographically located in what is known as the Ring of Fire, the kind of crack on the earth which rims the Pacific, and where you have all of this networking of movements underneath, the earthquakes and the volcanoes, and all of this that will be erupting at any time without any prediction whatsoever. So that makes our country a huge source of the steam that comes from the bowels of the earth. And then we had all of these hydroelectric plants that have also been constructed, the hydroelectric dams that were also constructed, not just for the source of energy, but also for irrigation, plus several others of this massive infrastructure. Let us not forget to mention all of the hospitals, tertiary hospitals that were built at the time, which since then, nobody, not any administration nor any president, has replicated at all. We could have had another kidney center, or we could have had 18 kidney centers in the 18 regions of our country. We could have had 18 heart centers also in every region of our country, lung centers, and other centers which was already on the table to be constructed, but naabutan nga ng 1985, ng 1986, the trauma center, which is so important today, and then of course several others other than these hospitals. Why is it that no administration after Ferdinand Marcos has been able to construct another tertiary hospital anywhere in the Philippines to be able to assist today? What do we have? 105 million of us. And we have all of this need for dialysis, etc., kidney transplants, and so forth. Why has no one and no administration followed suit? That is the past we talk about. But other than that, there were 38 dams that were also built. There were only 2 dams built afterwards. Why so? Now that we need sources of energy, now that we need irrigation for our fields. This has also been forgotten, or they were not continued. We don't know why. Is it because Marcos started it on a very massive scale? And several others. Our seaports and airports. We talk of Cebu as the Queen City in the Visayas. Why did Cebu become this way? Because one of the first things that President Marcos did after the 1969 presidential elections was to have a massive infrastructure program for Cebu. Because he won in Cebu against the son of Cebu, an Osmeña, who has his roots, his family, and his traditions there entrenched in Cebu, but Marcos won in that province overwhelmingly. And so he poured in infrastructure for Cebu by way of rewarding them for the trust and the confidence that they gave him for the second time, because that was already his re-election. Seaports, airports, bridges connecting the islands and the little islands, Mactan, etc., and all of this were all constructed in Cebu. Electrification likewise. So when we take pride as a Cebuano na we are so progressive and we're the most progressive in the Cebu, in the Visayas region, and that is the reason why. That was President Marcos, that was martial law period. And several other things which I could mention, and I've mentioned so many times. And that is why it pains us, our generation, who have gone through this, who've seen it, who've lived through it. And you likewise who are listening to us, I am already hoarse sometimes. I stumble over my words, talking and reading all about this. But there is a duty that we have, because this is a past that they want to erase, that they want to remove, that they want to misrepresent, according to Mr. Rod Katipunan. But why so? What is good perhaps should last until it is still good forever. And that is precisely why there is a sadness we have that many of the things that are already in the offing or already on the takeoff during the time were just immediately ignored, or they were thrown I don't know where. But that is why it is sad that in spite of the fact that we have all of this already waiting to just progress our country, they were all just shut up or kept quiet. Now we have President Duterte saying that he's looking into the opening of the nuclear plant. We were the first in the Southeast Asian region. In fact, the building of our nuclear plant in Bataan was just about the same time that the same company, which is Westinghouse, was also building a nuclear plant in Korea, in South Korea. Now South Korea has 5 or 6 or even 7 nuclear plants, and look at how its progress has developed in such, gigantic leaps. And our nuclear plant is still sleeping, to be refurbished, to be started up again. And several other things that the President Marcos already had as a vision to make this country great again. That was his idea. He wrote several books regarding this. He delivered his speeches all about this, not just to say that this is what we have accomplished, but this is where we are heading. But the most important, which I believe that he has given us during that time, not just the sense of identity as a Filipino, but the sense of pride and honor. You will see the First Lady, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, whenever she would be entrusted with a diplomatic mission, how she would be sitting down and meeting with heads of state and heads of government, and they would listen to her in awe, not because she had all of this sophisticated diplomat's language, but because she knew exactly how to deliver the message of peace, of understanding, of cooperation, and of friendship with all these different countries. Can you imagine her entering the communist country of the People's Republic of China at the height of the powers of Chairman Mao Zedong, just after the Cultural Revolution, of Zhou Enlai, of Deng Xiaoping, and to have the wife of Chairman Mao, Madame Chan, to be her escort. And in the next visit, Mr. Deng Xiaoping was also her escort. So can you imagine the honor given to her by these strong leaders of one of the most progressive now economic power in our Asian region? And then she also was able to penetrate the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, when all the other republics were part of the Soviet Union, and to be able to have them sit with her and for her to receive the award as a comrade which is a very rare privilege and honor given to any head of state, more so to a first lady. And she was given that award as a comrade, meaning you are one with us. And that was the objective precisely, to understand each other, to have peace, to think that when she went to Moscow at the time, we had the surrogate war actually happening in Vietnam between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with the thousands of soldiers passing through our country, because here we still had the military bases of the Americans. So you can imagine how this First Lady, just by her presence and by her simple words, was able to penetrate these two republics, these two governments, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet republics, in such a manner that we established diplomatic relations with both these countries. And she was also likewise able to penetrate the heart of the Middle East and another country which has been demonized and considered to be the enemy of the United States of America, and that is the Jamahariya of Libya, because Colonel Gaddafi was, not only by intelligence report, but in actuality, directly supporting a secessionist and an independence movement in the South. Can you imagine Mindanao, Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi to be supplied with arms and all other logistical support by one of the richest countries in the northern African region, Libya, and Muammar Gaddafi, supporting the rebels to secede, to break away from the Republic of the Philippines. And Mrs. Marcos was sent there to talk to Colonel Gaddafi about peace in Mindanao, and to be able to have come out with the Tripoli Agreement, which was discussed lengthily by long distance between President Ferdinand Marcos and Colonel Gaddafi, in such a manner that they were able to come up with the Tripoli Agreement, which was thrown into a plebiscite to the people of not just the 10 regions that I'm talking about, but all the way up to Davao. And, all the provinces, as a matter of fact, of Mindanao, precisely because it is a question as to whether they would want to establish a regional autonomous government in order to have peace, or to have the country segregated by a secessionist movement by the rebels, the MNLF, the MILF, and whatever else they were called at the time. And we had the Tripoli Agreement successfully signed between the two governments and discussed lengthily by both Colonel Gaddafi and President Marcos, until such time that we had peace from 1977 after the plebiscite in Mindanao until 1985, until 1986, or at least the first month of 1986. That was what was established, and that was what was achieved during that time. Was it martial law? No. It was the strength of leadership of President Marcos, with or without martial law. It was his initiative, his vision, and his trust to his wife that would be able to come up with that message of peace with these hard-headed, hard-thinking leaders of the world. These were actually people that were very difficult to deal with insofar as other countries are concerned, and she was able to successfully produce the results of having peace and establishing good relations with these countries. That was the period then. So what is it that we talk about when we say that that was the darkest period of our history? This is a desecration, actually, of our contemporary history, if I may say so myself. Having covered the office of the president during that time, having seen them up close, personal, professionally, and politically, I can say that with all the documents that I have gathered myself, the diaries I have kept, that was a glorious period in our past. With all the faults that perhaps the person of President Marcos may have had, with all the faults that perhaps you would attach to Mrs. Marcos, perhaps all of this will be covered by the great acts that they have achieved and what they have done, not for themselves, but for the Filipino people. If you would look, for instance, at all the accusations, two of them stand out. This human rights cases violation, which actually has not been proven anywhere in any court, except a claim for compensation and damages over acts which have not been proven with beyond reasonable doubt. And then, of course, the so-called amassing of so much wealth. Oh my goodness. Where is this wealth coming from? That is exactly the question that was asked at the New York trial of Mrs. Marcos. Remember, that case was filed against Ferdinand E. Marcos et al. Because the case itself, or the complaint itself, violated a law which said it is a criminal syndicate that President Marcos had running the Philippine government, because the RICO case is a Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act. I repeat that. Everybody says RICO, RICO, RICO case. What is it? Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. Racketeering influence. You know the meaning of racketeering. This is the underworld, the sleazy Balzacian societies in the underground, those that are involved in crime, in prostitution, in illicit affairs, in illicit drugs, and all of this. That is racketeering. Racketeering influenced and corrupt organization. And that was the accusation that was thrown at President Marcos and not just his entire government, but his wife and several other individuals. Nahiya naman sila na sabihin buong pamahalaan ni Ferdinand E. Marcos ang kanilang i-accuse. Can you imagine all 31 or 32 cabinet members will be hired to the New York trial because they are part of that corrupt organization of Ferdinand Marcos, as they claim? Di ba nakakatawa? They just didn't know what they would accuse him of, because they were trying to link up the payments that were made for the 4 real estate buildings in Manhattan, New York City. Oh my goodness, you're on top of the hill in New York City. And can you imagine, you had Ferdinand Marcos, or at least the alleged money of Ferdinand Marcos, buying those real estate properties. And so they decided to come up with the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act by saying that he got all the money of the Filipino people and bought these real estate properties. Yun na nga ang sinasabi nila, hindi ba? But that case was already filed. That was, in fact, the first case filed in Los Angeles in the court of Mariana Felser. And that was why they said that even in LA, and so also in several parts of the United States, they were not zeroing in yet in New York, Marcos brought the money of the Filipino people, which he stole, because that is the corrupt organization of Marcos, and bought real estate properties in the United States of America. Kaya doon nila kinone. But that an amateurish, stupid way of doing such a connection, because the main question in court was exactly, where did the money in those Swiss banks that paid for these buildings come from? Saan nanggaling yung pera doon sa mga bangko sa Switzerland, kung saan nagkaroon ng transfer doon sa mga bangko sa Switzerland, sa mga bangko sa Amerika, hanggang umabot sa mga bangko sa New York at nakabili ng mga real estate properties doon. Saan nanggaling yung pera? Well, the mightiest sword of justice, which is the Justice Department of the United States of America, and the State Department assisting it, and the Department and the government of Switzerland, and the government of the Republic of the Philippines at that time, with all 350,000 documents and 95 witnesses in court testifying against the Marcoses, there was not one single document that could show that money was taken from the treasury of the Republic of the Philippines and brought to America to buy those buildings. Kaya yung judge mismo, nagkalat na ng papel doon sa kanyang lamesa. At sinabihan niya yung prosecution, those that were accusing Marcos in the court, you call them the prosecutors, Charles Labella, Debra Livingston, and that other little guy, I forgot his name. Thank God I did. Tatlo sila. And they were even pointing straight to Mrs. Marcos' face and the tip of her nose, accusing her of having stolen the money of the Filipino people. And yet, wala silang nahanap na dokumento. And not one witness could say it. To this day, that is the challenge I pose to everyone. If you have any document or any evidence that can be brought to court, there are still about 8 cases. Out of the 986 cases filed against Imelda Marcos, may natitira pang 8 because all the other cases were already dismissed for lack of merit, for lack of evidence. There are still 8 pending. If you have any at all that could prove that they stole the money of the Filipino people, come forth and go to court and present it. Otherwise, we pray, like in weddings, forever hold your silence if you have no objection. So that it is that the past has always been represented by people who want to represent it. We cannot change their minds. We cannot change their thoughts. We cannot change their hearts. We can only pray to God that one day their conscience would perhaps ring true with the truth itself. And as we say, the more I talk, that's the more I chip truth, because truth is like a diamond. The more you cut it out, the more I talk about it, the brighter it shines. Let this be our guide. With all the misrepresentation presented, it is only the truth that will really set us free. All of these exaggerations and all of these falsifications, that too is transgression of the truth. So be well, be healthy, keep yourself safe. Despite this pandemic, the pandemic in the minds of others, let us be true to ourselves and true to the dignity and the honor of a Filipino. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi for your hour.